Chapter 1. The Horror in Clay. "Whose turn is it tonight?" Kevin asked curiously to the group of Kabbalistic campers. The cramped logs of the campfire snapped, crackled, and popped with a ferocious intensity under the translucent white glow of the full moon. Kevin carefully curated each and every log like a master chef hand-picking his own berries out of a field. The crackles of the dried-out pine branches flung sparks from the campfire with almost a sentient intelligence. The icy chill of the New England air flowed through the campgrounds, like the howling gust of the dust swirling around a Texas tornado. The effervescent glow from the moonlight dimly lit the outer brinks of the campground, like the felt of a billiard table basking under the crystalline beam of a neon bar sign. The endless rows of arborous species acted as a natural barrier careening around the campsite. As the fire brewed, the aromatic stench of the beach was drowned out by the fresh scent of pine. The putrid fragrance of rotting seaweed was offset by the refined scent of crisply pruned pinewood. "I'm up tonight," Mike Allen said while patiently poking the campfire with a long, angular twig. "Woohoo! Great! Another insurance horror story?" Kevin asked while squishing his toes deep into the moist sand of the Mohegan Bluffs. The sand was as medescent as a full stack of flapjacks, soaked in blackstrap molasses. Kevin was far more accustomed to walking barefooted around the campfire, like a bohemian prancing around a mulberry tree. "Oh no, my deductible! Ah!" Deirdre said half-jokingly. She waved her hands around and dangled her fingers like a bunch of wind chimes lazily wafting in a breeze. The hazy adumbration from the campfire produced a contorted shadow that danced on her freckly fair skin. John jumped on the dog pile of verbal barrages and said, "The tale of the claims adjuster from hell, bum, bum, bum. You've been denied." As the group of friends fondled the fire, they took a second to bask under the brilliant bloom of the Mohegan moon. The moon radiated with a translucent blue that sensuously soaked the campground. This particular part of the Mohegan Bluffs was as secluded as the stories were secretive. So secretive, in fact, that even the native New Englanders relied on the use of maps to traverse the local hiking trails. Mike smirked while poking the logs of the campfire with a misshapen twig. The tip of the twig had been worn down by Mike's unrelenting prodding. The twig was firm, yet slim, almost like a diving rod. Mike smiled and concentrated on the smoldering fire, like the myopic trance of a mental patient under deep sleep hypnosis. He briefly raised his head up, just enough to make eye contact with his friends. The peaks of his brow arched higher than the Sydney Opera House. Mike's olive skin glistened against the emanating effulgence from the campfire. Mike slowly started to nod his head and said, "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage too far. Philosophers have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient incidents." Mike paused as a way to solicit feedback from the group. He always found a stealthy, strategic pause to be an invaluable litmus test for evaluating the general level of audience interest. He continued prodding the campfire without speaking a word. Pleased by the lack of response, he took a self-congratulatory mental victory lap and continued his story. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden eons which chills me when I think of it, and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things. In this case, an old newspaper item and the notes of a dead professor. I call this story The Call of Cthulhu. "Now we're talking," Kevin sharply said with an errant tone of voice. His spirits were as renewed as a teenager learning about the limited duration of his refractory period for the first time. Mike abruptly stopped and looked at his friend with a half-cocked head tilt. 4 years in a row, Mike was voted most likely to remain class clown. Kevin, on the other hand, was voted most likely to rule the world. Both men came from similar upbringings, working-class families in the suburbs, but never surmounted the end of their secondary school experience until this very summer. Around the campfire, Mike and Kevin often butted heads. Even the most conterminous friendships had their limits. Two alpha males at the apex of puberty constantly competing for position, like two rams butting heads to impress a ewe in heat. "Shh!" Deirdre scolded her fellow camper. She slapped Kevin on the knee and nudged him with her callipygus curvature. Deirdre and Kevin had been awful cozy during the last couple of campfire escapades, but tonight there was an unusual tension between them. Deirdre removed her ball cap and started pulling back her hair with long stroking motions behind her head. She pulled out a scrunchie that was hanging on her shoe and put her hair back into a bun. She grabbed the ball cap and squeezed the brim inwards to form an exaggerated crescent moon shape. Like I was saying, this is a story passed down from generation to generation. My grandfather learned it from his great-uncle. He told it to my father told it to me, and now I'm going to tell it to you. Kevin pulled out a thermos and charitably offered it up to the group to indulge. Kevin was a people-pleaser by nature and always found it most pleasing to bring hot cocoa to his soiree. Deirdre eagerly obliged by sticking out her hands, like a trick-or-treater cusping their hands for candy on Halloween. This hot cocoa was allegedly made from an old Hodges family recipe. I'd later find out from his mother that the secret ingredients were merely just rum and a dash of nutmeg. Kevin was never quite sure whether Deirdre showed up for the stories or for the hot cocoa, but either way, he appreciated her persistent attendance. Deirdre with a cup of hot cocoa was as bubbly as a beauty queen popping bottles of champagne. In our senior yearbook, she was voted most likely to become an infamous supermodel. She practically stitched the award into the inner lining of her Letterman jacket. Mike continued, "I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him." Kevin popped off the lid of the thermos and started pouring some hot cocoa for his friends. Mike started looking around the campsite for some storytelling aids. Mike always found that storytelling wasn't so much about the actual story itself, but how you told the story. He stood up with his hot cocoa in hand and said, "My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 with the death of my great-uncle, Kevin Hodges, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island." "Really? You put me in the story? Let me guess. I get killed off in some gruesome comical fashion. Or maybe I am Cthulhu," Kevin said while seditiously slurping some of the smoldering hot cocoa. Mike loudly scoffed at the comment and continued, "Like I was saying, Professor Hodges was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking man who had come from one of the queer dark courts on the precipitous hillside which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man was responsible for the end. At the time, I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder." John raised up his hand and asked, "Lesion of the heart, how'd they figure that? Seems rather obtuse to just guess that out of the blue." "Yeah, how'd they figure that? I thought his death was a mystery," Kevin asked to amplify John's question. Mike flung up his hands and said, "Do I come to your work and tell you how to flip hamburgers? When it's your turn next week, you can tell the story however you want." Bunch of backseat storytellers. John pressed his glasses up against the brim of his nose and started laughing at Mike's delicate sensibilities. His laugh was as hollow as the belly of a Copacabana conga drum. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and was as skinny as a rail. He couldn't have weighed more than 170 pounds soaking wet. His skin was as pale as freshly laundered linen sitting outside in a Somerville snowstorm. The only blemishes on his alabaster skin were the spots of adolescent acne scattered across his face, like splatters of blood at a crime scene. In our senior yearbook, John was voted most likely to become a ninja. Unfortunately for John, ninjas were in short supply in New England, so John did the next best thing. He enlisted in the Marines. This was probably his last campfire for a while. He was set to start basic training in about 3 weeks or so. Mike looked around the campfire for his cue to continue. Unmolested by any further heckling, he said, "As my great-uncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society. But there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from showing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor carried in his pocket. Then, indeed, I succeeded in opening it, but when I did so, seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of the disjointed jottings, ramblings, and cutting which I found? Had my uncle, in his later years, become credulous of the most superficial impostures? I resolved to search out the eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. Mike sighed and clasped onto his hot cocoa with both hands. He embraced the cup of molten sugary goodness like a newborn baby caressing a warm bottle of formula. The ordinarily fresh New England air was weighed down by the bellowing smoke plumes exuding from the campfire. There was a medescent quality to the air, like the steam extruding from a dishwasher. Mike grabbed the stick from the ground and started outlining a figure into the sand. The campers peered over the fire to examine the elusive illustration. The drawing was as obscure as a Rorschach test and as legible as ancient Egyptian Sanskrit. Mike started to explain the drawing to his fellow campers, like an abstract artist describing his art to attendees at an upscale Brooklyn art gallery. The bas-relief was a rough rectangle less than an inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for, although the vagaries of cubism and futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. And writing of some kind the bulk of these designs seems certainly to be, though my memory, despite much the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species, or even hint at its remotest affiliations. Mike finished his drawing and continued. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evident pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a deceased fancy could conceive. Mike started making various hand gestures like an Italian guy in any given hypothetical situation. He continued with a deep tone of voice. "If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yields simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing." Mike daintily draped his hand over to mimic the head of the octopus and said, "A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background." Deirdre snuggled up to Kevin as Mike delved deeper into the story. Her head perfectly plopped onto his shoulder like the snugness of a 3 by 8 inch socket wrenched tightly securing the head of a 3 by 8 inch bolt. Kevin was more than familiar with the warm embrace of her head, which, as of late, was more physical than emotional. Her curly ginger bangs draped over his shoulder like the tentacles of a giant octopus dangling over a school of fish. The writing accompanying this oddity, aside from the stack of press cuttings in Professor Hodge's most recent hand, and made no pretense to literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of, Mike said with an ominous disposition. Mike plunged back down onto the pine log. The log was as rough as sand and as cold as an icebox. He immediately shivered and put his hands up to the fire. After customarily rubbing his hands together, he again polled the audience with a questionable gaze. This manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island, and the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. Bonilla, 121 Bainville Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, at 1908 AAS meeting, notes on same, and Professor Webb's account. Mike started perusing the ground for some kind of instructive aid. He quickly scanned the accoutrement for a usable visual prop. On the ground was a local map of the area. Mike snatched the map from the ground and began to fold it back up. He held up the folded map and said, "The other manuscript papers were brief notes, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons, some of them citations from philosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria, and the rest comments on long-surviving secret societies and hidden cults, with references to passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to outre, mental illness, and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very particular tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Hodges bearing the singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family slightly known to him, who had latterly been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design and living alone at the Fleur-de-Lis building near that institution. Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself physically hypersensitive, but the staid folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely different. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. "Sounds a lot like you, Mike," Kevin said while snugly wrapping his arm around Deirdre's shoulder. Mike smirked and held up both middle fingers. His fingers were as stiff as rigor mortis. Kevin opened his lips as wide as a whale shark preparing to eat breakfast and shot back a shit-eating grin bigger than a Cheshire cat after a full plate of lasagna. Mike relaxed his hands for a moment, and it was evident to the group that he had lost his train of thought. His mind was a wander, like an author who forgot to drink his second cup of coffee. "Now, where was I?" Mike asked with ease. Deirdre interjected the childish show of bravado and said, "I think you were talking about the manuscript." Mike replied in a sassy tone, "Ah, yes. Before I was so rudely interrupted, I was getting to the manuscript." On the occasion of the visit ran the professor's manuscript. The sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics of the bas-relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner, which suggested pose and alienated sympathy, and my uncle showed some sharpness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was of a fantastically poetic cast which must have typified his whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new, indeed. For I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or a garden-girdled Babylon. It was then that he began that rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleepy memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters. Mike reclaimed the stick from before and scratched a jumble of letters into the sand. The letters looked like a random assortment of tiles you might get while playing Scrabble. The letters read, Cthulhu Fatagan. The group of campers huddled around the fire to observe the mishmash of letters. Everyone was understandably confused by the meaning, let alone the pronunciation. One by one, the group attempted to utter the befuddling phrase. Kevin was first. Cat, Lou, Hug, Fat, Nug? Followed by Deirdre. Cthulhu? John proclaimed. Mike smiled and softly spoke the words, Cthulhu. The group shouted in a staggered unison, Cthulhu. Mike took a momentary victory lap in his head and belayed the continuation of his story as he pieced together the remaining parts. He was putting the puzzle pieces together as quickly as a professional jigsaw competitor at the annual American Association of Jigsaw Enthusiasts. Mike took a second to adjust his sleeveless denim button-down vest. In reality, it wasn't a vest at all. It was merely just a denim jacket with the sleeves lazily torn off. Mike had numerous badges glued onto the vest, like chest candy on a highly decorated military uniform. Mike sternly repeated the word, Cthulhu. His eyes had glazed over. His retinas blackened by the smoke, his nostrils flaring from the agitation of the embers. Mike took in a deep, slow breath of the smoke. He inhaled the fumes of the smoke like a dragon breathing in smoldering ashes. He continued with an expedited pace. This verbal jumble was the key to the recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Hodges. He questioned the sculptor with scientific minuteness, and studied with frantic intensity the bas-relief on which the youth had found himself working. Chilled and clad only in his night clothes, when waking had stolen bewilderingly over him. My uncle blamed his old age, Wilcox afterwards said, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphics and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies, and Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence, which he was offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some widespread mystical or paganly religious body. When Professor Hodges became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview, the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imaginary whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone, with a subterranean voice or intelligence shouting monotonously in enigmatical sense impacts inscribable save as gibberish. The two sounds frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and Relia. Then what happened? Deirdre asked, completely captivated by the creativity of the curious tale. Then? Well, then, March 23. The manuscript continued. Wilcox failed to appear. and inquiries at his quarters revealed that he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He had cried out in the night, arousing several other artists in the building, and had manifested since then only alternations of unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often at the Thayer Street office of Dr. Toby, whom he learned to be in charge. The youth's febrile mind, apparently, was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not only a repetition of what he had formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on a gigantic thing miles high, which walked or lumbered about. What was it? John asked. Mike nodded his head as he continued. What was it? That's a good question. Unfortunately, he at no time fully described this object, but occasional frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Toby, convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence into lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but the whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than mental disorder. Mike paused for a moment and downed what was left of his hot cocoa. The warmth of the hot cocoa varnished his throat, giving off this aromatic steam from his mouth as he spoke, like the vapors steaming from a freshly brewed pot of coffee. Here's where it gets really weird, he said while discarding the cup like a cigarette butt quickly being flung from a car window. The thing is, the weird thing is, on April 2nd at about 3 p.m. or so, every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find himself at home and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days, but to Professor Hodges he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. And just like that, he was what, cured? Come on, man, Kevin asked. Mike smiled and continued unmolested by the question. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons covering the same period as that in which young Wilcox had his strange visitations. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries among nearly all the friends who he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of his request seems to have varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. The original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result, though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23 and April 2, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more affected, though 4 cases of vague description suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes, and in 1 case there is mentioned a dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was, lacking their original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions, or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see. That is why I continued to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of the old data which my uncle had possessed, had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from aesthetes told a disturbing tale. From February 28 to April 2, a large proportion of them had dreamed very bizarre things, the intensity of the dreams being immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half-sounds not unlike those which Wilcox had described, and some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of the gigantic nameless thing visible toward the last. One case, which the note describes with emphasis, was very sad. The subject, a widely known architect with leanings toward philosophy and occultism, went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure, and expired several months later after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I should have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation, but as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. I have often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as did this fraction. It is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cuttings, as I have intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania, and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Hodges must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extracts was tremendous, and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Mike paused to make his point and catch his breath. In great haste, he continued to enumerate the cases. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. Here, likewise, a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a philosophaster colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest toward the end of March 22 to 23. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumor and legendry, and a fantastic painter named Arnaud Bonon hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926. And so, numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle could have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cuttings, all told, as I can at this date scarcely envisage the callous rationalism with which I set them aside. But I was then convinced that young Wilcox had known of the older matters mentioned by the professor. Mike stood up and outstretched his hands like his savior on the crucifix. Sitting on a log had the benefits of retaining heat from the campfire, but was about as comfortable as wearing concrete pajamas. Well, this seems like a good time for a break. Anyone else hungry? Mike asked while scrounging around the icebox for a snack. He pillaged the icebox like a bunch of ungrateful relatives rummaging around in unmarked boxes of a deceased relative's attic. What do we have here? I brought some more stuff, John said gleefully. Whip those bad boys out, Kevin instinctively replied while drumming on his knees. Deirdre bounced up and started happily hunting down some sticks to make the s'mores. Luckily, we kept a fresh supply of bundled twigs near the campfire. She rounded up about a dozen or so and balanced them between her arms and bosom. For years, boys never paid her the time of day. Then last summer, that all changed. That was the summer she turned 18. That was the summer she filled out her figure. That was the summer she turned into a bit of a different person.